Hello and welcome back to the Django DRF and React series. So far in this series, we built a simple RESTful API with Django and also the React front end. In the second tutorial, we looked at permissions and how we could apply them. And then in the last tutorial, we looked at token-based authentication. So we pretty much built a system from the ground using token-based authentication, and what we ended up with is a whole system where we could register, log in and log out. Hasn't been completely fleshed out here. You can see this is just for us to indicate that we've got these facilities here. And you can see that these posts here, this is a simple blog application. These posts here are being generated from our Django RESTful API. So the back end of this tutorial, we're going to go back into React and Django, and we're going to apply what we're going to be talking about today to build a new feature here. So obviously we can look at all these different posts here, but what we want to do now is drill down to these posts and look at them individually. So that's what we're ultimately going to build in this tutorial. But the main focus of this tutorial is going to be viewsets and routers. So now we've got the DRF project off the ground, we can now focus on further feature development, as well as theories, best practices, code patterns, and techniques. The topic of this tutorial, some might consider is on the advanced side of things, but I strongly believe that you can develop more effectively knowing what is possible rather than knowing how to code out something. Because more often than not, there's loads of tutorials online to help you write code, but very little telling you what is possible. So this is one of those, and hopefully you can then explore the topic further at the end of this tutorial. But hopefully I'll just give you a grounding and an underpinning knowledge for you to apply to your project if you want to, and then research further. So the flow of this tutorial, we're going to go over what viewsets are and actually apply them. We'll provide you some examples, of course, and then we'll have a look at routers. So these two technologies really come in hand, they work together. So once we've done that, provided some examples, we'll then move slowly forward to where we want to be, and that's building a single post or detail view so that we can create an API endpoint that we can point at that's going to retrieve an individual post that we request in our React front-end application. So the question to begin with then is, why would I want to use viewsets or routers? So obviously you probably got no idea what that is at the moment. So let's just put a picture in your mind, the problem. So as your project scales, increasingly you get a large amount of views. So this is probably typical in any Django project as things scale up. But in addition to that, you also scale up the endpoints, because here utilizing RESTful APIs, typically every view has an endpoint or potentially multiple endpoints. Again, that's not too dissimilar to developing a normal Django application where you have views and your URLs. But in addition to that, we can also see there's a lot of repetition of code in the views. So you've probably seen this already. For example, we've only written 2 views here, but you can see there's repetition here. For example, we're using the same query set, although we're using a different manager here. We're using the same query set. So could we kind of remove that, slim that down? Now, of course, that's just one line of code there, but when you start scaling this up in your project, that becomes a lot more coding that you need to develop. So ideally, you want to follow the dry principles here of not repeating yourself. So these technologies that we're going to introduce, the viewsets and routers, that's going to help us overcome some of these problems. And as you probably already started to find out, managing multiple endpoints or URLs can become difficult to maintain. Sometimes you need to have them in the right order, for example, for them to work properly, and so on. So again, viewsets and routers, particularly routers in this case, is going to help us overcome and alleviate some of those problems, again, particularly of larger projects. So first of all, we're going to have a look at viewsets, and then we'll feed in routers, so to get an idea of how they work together. So a viewset is considered a way or a method to speed up API development by basically having to write less code. That's essentially what's happening here. We have to be less explicit because Django in the background has the code pre-written for us in, for example, other classes and mixins in the background. So because we're utilizing this, similar to class-based views, we have this level of abstraction. So there's a lot of things going on in the background that unless we really drill down into and read through, we won't truly know what's going on. And that can make it difficult for some to develop with view sets because you have to have an understanding what's happening in the background. I kind of take a different opinion here, and I think that it makes it easier for you to write code. If you don't know what's happening in the background, all you need to know is what you can do, and then just leave the background code to do what it does, at least in some situations. So what's happening here then with the view set is we can bunch up classes. So essentially we can replace multiple views with a single view set. So what we're doing with view sets is we're basically just slimming down code. We're trying to match similar classes and then we're going to put them together. We still have the function of both of those or more than one or two, of those classes that we bunch together. So we still got all the functionality that they provide, those individual classes, but it just allows us to write less code. We can start to strip code that's similar between those classes, and we put these classes together in a view set, and it just makes it easier. And like we have at the top here, it can speed up development. So like I said, repeated logic can be combined. So ultimately, we're writing less code and it promotes dry. Don't repeat yourself. So let's have a look at actually applying this to our project. So you can download the code in the description. We're in the blog API here, application. So this is our Django backend. So here you can see that we've got in our views, we've got two views. One view that displays all the data, and we have one view here that deals with the individual items. So display all posts and just display one post, depending on the criteria that we provide. So let's just go into the core and our settings. Let's just turn off the authentication so that we can utilize the interface. So we've got the server on, so let's go into our front end here. So here we're using the API view. So you can see here that this is our API endpoint. We've got all of the items from a database. There's only 2 items, and then I can drill down based upon ID into the individual posts. Okay, so that was the 2 different posts there, ID number 2. So that's how it matches up. So let's see how we can use viewpoints to cut out some of this code or reduce some of this code. So first of all, we need to actually import view sets. So let's go ahead and do that, REST framework. And what we're going to do is we're just going to remove these classes for now, and we're going to recreate them, but in a view set. So first of all, we're going to need a new class then, and we're going to apply a viewset.Viewset. So I'm going to show you 2 options. The first is the viewset.Viewset. So essentially what's happening here, this is a simple type of class-based view. So this is going to allow us to have some abstraction. In the background, it's going to be connected to everything that we want to potentially utilize to list or create files or posts, in this case, in the background. So here's the level of abstraction that it's providing. But what this does, the view set, is it provides us all the tools for us to do what we need to do. And now we can just select what tools that we want to use. So this is very much a top-down approach where we are just given everything, and then we can prune and change and delete or remove the items that we don't need. So that probably sounds a little bit abstract. So let's have a look at what I mean. So we've got our view set here. Now, previously, we needed the query set, we needed the serializer, and we did have permission classes. So we can still continue using permission classes in our view set. That is just something that we can just take out and place there. So that's something we can learn about the view set. We can just use the normal permission classes as per normal. What we can also do is define the query set. We only need to do this once, and we can do it right at the top here. And now that can be utilized for all the other functions that we create. So now it's up to us to actually then build in what it is that we need, the functionality that we need. So what we have here in green is basically all the different options. So for example, if I want to do the first class here, this just basically lists out all the items. So this is just a list. So I look at the tools that I've got available here, and I'm just saying, well, I want to use list. So now I'm just going to take a list and then create a new function here. So we just start off with the list, we call it list. So we have self and request. So we take that all in, and now I just need to define two things. First of all, the serializer that we're going to use, and that's pretty much it, because you can see up here we've got the query set. So let's go ahead and just paste that in. So we've got two items here, like I've said, the serializer and the return. Okay, notice that we need to include response. So we just need to import that in from the REST framework. There we go. So that's from the REST framework response. So we return the response here, which is basically the data from the serialized class, but remember it comes from the query set here. So we query the data, we run it through the serializer, and then we respond back. So that's a simple way of creating a list or to return a list utilizing ViewSet. So what's important here to understand when you're using ViewSet are these functions here, because this is all the power. So that's obviously listing items. So we can do that now. If we wanted to create an item, then obviously we would use this. Now remember, to create an item, you remember from our API, we send a post request. So the ViewSet doesn't necessarily work with get and post, but the meaningful action is translated into one of these functions here. So if I sent across a post request, obviously I would be asking to create something. So therefore I'd build this create function, which deals with all that functionality. So retrieve, that's essentially saying retrieve something from the database, normally a single item. So if I wanted to return an individual item, similar to what I've performed here previously, where we got the individual post, and obviously I'm going to use this right here. So let's go ahead and do exactly that. So the next up, I just want to make a simple function here. Let's just remove that. So you can see here I'm using retrieve. So I then go ahead and utilize post equals get object or 404. So what I'm doing here is I'm getting an individual object, of course, from my database. So what database am I using? Well, I'm just using this database up here still. So you can see here that I've asked for this pk equals pk, the primary key. So essentially what that is there is when I type in this number here to get the individual post, that essentially becomes the primary key. So that gets passed across to my view here, then into the retrieve. I then can capture that through the request, and then you can see that I can then utilize it to get a single object from the database. I then, of course, run it through the serializer, and then I then send a response, which is obviously the data returned back from the serializer. There we go. So there we go. We now have two functions utilizing ViewSet. So at the moment when we try this out, it won't work, okay, because there's a conflict now. We created URLs for this. Now the URLs or the existing URLs won't work with this implementation. So this is where router comes in. So whereas before we had to actually define all the routes for our views, now we have routers, or the possibility of automatically generating URL patterns for the views that we have. So the routes that will be created for each and every view set will include the possibility for us to automatically create, retrieve, update, and destroy. So when the router creates a route for our view, it automatically sets up all of the routes that we might need to create, retrieve, update, and destroy. So basically it's just an automated way of creating URLs, But instead of creating individual ones, it just creates everything that you could possibly want or need for that particular view. Of course, can be overwritten and we can apply individual routes if we want to, but this is a handy tool potentially you might want to utilize to automatically create URL patterns. So this probably looks familiar. We have our URL patterns for both of the different views that we had. So what we can do now is just remove those because we're not going to use those. In the view, you see that we're only using post list now to define both of these actions. So we're not going to need post detail. So that slims it down there. So now what we have, we can remove no, we'll keep that for now. So now what we can do is bring in our router. So we don't need path anymore. We just need to bring in our views, and then we just need to bring in the router. So from the REST framework, again, we're using routers. So there's no installation here. We just need to bring in the tools from the REST framework, and that's the default router. So we then bring in the default router into a variable here so we can access it. And now we're going to make essentially a new URL, which is going to be this. So we've got here router.register to register a new route. And you can see here, this is just the default route as per normal. Let me just bring back the old URL so you can see them. So here we had this view right here. This is just the root directory. So the API / and nothing, the root directory for that. You can see we're using post list again. And this time we're just going to have a base name instead of name. We're just going to call it user, but we could change that if you want to. Okay, so that's all we need to do there. And then finally, we'll say, actually, we'll tell Django that we're not using URL patterns anymore, and the router will now take over the URL patterns. So that's why we have that last piece of code right there. So we can, actually, I just want to change this to post to make it a little bit more relevant. So that should be it. Well, let's go into the front end now and have a look. So let's start off with our base. There we go. So you can see that we're returning in our route both of the items that are in the database, and we should now be able to also select by ID the individual items. There we go, ID number 1 and then number 2. There we go, ID number 2. So just to summarize, the most important aspect there of ViewSet is that in our React application, like I previously mentioned, we might be posting information, or we might be requesting or sending a GET request. Now that's familiar if you've seen the other tutorials. Remember, we use post and get to get data from our RESTful API. Now ViewSet is going to translate this into create, list, delete, etc. So that's how things are kind of being moved across, and the translation between post and what then is actually performed and the functions that we create in the ViewSet. So that's pretty much the big take home thing here to kind of learn and remember if we want to use ViewSets and just explicitly almost create our views, but also with the possibility of bringing in other code if we want to. So here, the key main element here in terms of dry, don't repeat yourself, was we were actually then bringing in the query set and only applying it, or assigning it once. So the question is now, can we also bring in a serializer class without having to define it here? Well, you can see in actual fact that isn't necessarily going to be possible because of how we're utilizing or how we're serializing. We're still utilizing the same post serializer. So that's not always going to be possible. So we're not going to move across and provide you an example of all of these, but as we go through this series, there'll be no doubt opportunities for us to just revisit this and create some more functions here. So let's just focus on the router for a couple of seconds here. So you can see that the router is automatically providing the facility to not only supply this route or this endpoint, but also the endpoint for the individual instance. So let's just see what's happening in the background. If I just do something here, you can see that these are all the routes that are available. So the router is automatically building these routes here, anything with API on. So I mentioned that the router automatically creates routes so that it can potentially handle create, retrieve, updates, destroy, etc. So that's pretty much what it's done here. We're not going to drill down into these individual items here. Now it's worth checking out the tutorial that we built on the topic of regular expressions, because that's going to help you understand what it is that you're looking at in these different paths here. So what all these symbols mean, etc. So definitely have a look at that tutorial if you want to understand that a little bit more, but we're not going to go into that right now. All we need to understand here is that the router is going to create automatic paths for us to be able to perform multiple operations. That just does that automatically. And important to also understand, like I mentioned, is that you can see that it's capturing the item as this PK here. So let's just go back into this again in our API. So when I type in 1 here, that's being passed over to our view as PK. And that's going to be important to remember in the next example. So now we're going to take a look at ModelViewSet, which is the secondary item that we can utilize up here. So instead of ViewSet, we can now utilize ModelViewSet. So let's just remove this, or just line comment this out. Let's recreate this again, but utilizing ViewSet, ModelViewSet. So the ModelViewSet provides us a much more powerful set of tools. I say powerful. What I mean by that is it just abstracts a little bit more for us, so that we need to do even less. So this is all the code originally that we've written for these two views. This was what we ended up with utilizing view sets. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing, but with the model view set. So here we go. There we go. That's it. So that's all you need to write. So you've got the permission class and the serializer class. We're probably going to need a query set in actual fact. So let's just bring in a query set. There we go. So that's it. So let's have a look to see if that works. So let's go to our API home. There we go. That seems to be working. And then the individual posts, number 1, ID number 1, and then number 2. So this takes us to another level of abstraction. Behind the scenes, the model view set is importing different mix-ins. In actual fact, it inherits from the generic API view. And you can read about the generic API view in the manual or the documentation, and that'll give you an idea of what tools it has available. Now, if you just hover over it, it actually tells you here, it's a view set that provides a default create, retrieve, update, partial update, destroy, and list. So it has all the functionality that we need. If we tie it up or connect it up to our router, you can see that our router already has all the tools that it needs. And all we need to do, I'm repeating myself here again, apologies, all we need to do is serialize and provide the query set. So hopefully you can see what's happening there. Again, we can utilize permission classes like before, that isn't a problem. So let's now expand this. So where something like that becomes a problem is once you start customizing or wanting something different from the default here. So you can see potentially here what's happening is that Django has pre-written code already, and that's just dealing with everything that we need. So if we want to overwrite this, then we can do. So if you followed or looked at any of the class-based views tutorials, for the promotion again, we started to go through this idea of that these classes here inherit other classes, so other code. And by doing so, it inherits all the attributes and functions within those classes. And those classes may then inherit from other classes and so on and so on. And we have also something called mix-ins, which also can be inherited in to create this multiple inheritance. And essentially, this is a map of code that's all connected together that we can utilize, and it's funneled down into this model view set, and then we can access some of those parameters. So let's have a look at how we can extend this. So there's probably two things that you want to extend here. One is to utilize a different query set. So we can define a custom query set. So why you might want to do that is because maybe you've utilized a query set for maybe multiple items here, or maybe remember that we might want to perform different actions based upon what the user has requested. So we might want to use different query sets depending on the type of request that we receive from the user. So similar here, we've got list, retrieve list, blah, blah, blah. So all this is still integrated here. We just need to be able to access it. So let's just define a custom query set. So we can do that through get query set. So this is how we define a custom query set. So we're going to overwrite the get query set. And again, this feature or this functionality is somewhere embedded in a inherited view or class that this model view set is connected to. So here you can see we're just going to use post object all again. So nothing's changed here, but just to give you an example of what's going on there. So we've got two items here, get query set, which is get the query set, so get the actual data we want to work with. And then we also have get object. So what we're actually doing now is we're going to build the functionality so that we can, in the browser, type in, for example, a category, for example, Django. And that would take us to all the posts that we have in Django. So we can build categories, but sorry, in actual fact, what we're going to build here is an example of when you actually select a post item, what's going to happen is we can put the ID in the top here, and then it's going to show that individual item. So that's what we're going to simulate and we're going to build. But what we probably want to do in actual fact is type in, for example, a slug name in order to get to the actual post. That's a little bit more SEO friendly than just utilizing a number, for example. So let's just go one step further. We're now going to just utilize a slug. So we need to add a slug field in the model shortly so that we can build some slugs like this so that we can navigate to individual posts. So now let's build out that facility to get this working. So what we're going to need to do is to overwrite the get object. So we want to define what we mean by getting a single object. So let's do that first. First of all, we're going to take in the primary key. So remember we've got these arguments here that we can take in. So what's happening here in the browser, we're typing in, for example, number 2. That's an argument which we can capture. So we're going to capture that through the KW arguments here. And you can then go ahead and save that in a new variable here called item. So let's just move that across. So here we go, we've captured it. Now remember it was called PK. So back in the browser here, remember we were sending across, it was referenced to as PK. So that's why we're utilizing PK here. So we're getting that item, whatever someone's typed in, we're putting it into this variable called item. And now what we need to do is I'll just run a query on an object. And so we just need to return and then use the get object or 404. So that's going to get a single object from the data. We're using the post model, and then we're saying that title equals item. Remember that the item is the number that we typed in, but we're not going to use numbers. Remember, we're going to be utilizing letters. Now, how that is possible, if you're wondering, because it says PK for primary key, so you'd be expecting possibly only numbers. If you go back in, it tells you here the format, and that's A to Z or 0 to 9. So that is why we can now type into this primary key holder here letters and numbers and capture them. So we've got that coming back now, and now we can use the title to access the individual post. Right, so that should do it, I think. So we just return the individual post. Good. So what's going to happen here then is that when we go to the root directory, this is just going to be fired off. That's what's going to happen because we don't have an object to run this. So that's why we get all the items. When we type in a post name into the URL, this is going to be fired off because we've got some data in order for this to be processed. So let's go ahead now and test. So we can see that if we go to the root directory, we still access everything. Now let's just take this title. It's called new. So this one here is called new one. So let's just take new. And there we go. So we now have the new item. Now you can imagine what we now have here is an endpoint that we can now use in React to point to this particular piece of data. So now what we've got is our individual view. So all we need to do now is go into React and then create a new page and then point Axios to request this item. And there we have an individual single post page. So before we start developing back in React, we're just going to turn everything back on from our server. So let's just go back into the settings of Django. So that's the core settings. And then we're just going to turn on the authentication class. So we'll do that. Okay, so we've got the authentication back now. So let's go back into our application here. It looks like we've got a problem. So let's just see if we can log in again. There seems to be an issue. So it looks like the network's down at the moment. So let's just find out why that is. So the problem here was there was two settings. First of all, we just need to reconfigure our URL paths because we're utilizing routes or the router, and also the path here I've moved down to the bottom. There's just some configuration conflict here with some of the permissions, and it was expecting us to be authenticated with JWT before we actually sign in, which is obviously impossible because we need to sign in first to get our tokens. So I put the tokens up the top here in the URL paths in the core there. Secondly, what you can also do in the settings, in the core settings, just change your origins. So you can add some more origins if you want to. I was using 127:3000, but in actual fact, I want to utilize localhost, or at least that's the only available origin that will be able to access this system. If you're wondering at this point, actually, well, if I have to specify who can connect to my REST API, well, wouldn't I have to specify everyone in the world? Of course, you can blanket this out so that anyone can access it and so on. So that's out of the scope of this tutorial, but just in case you were wondering that. So let's go back into React here. So what we're going to do, this can be a two-step process. We're just going to go over the first step. So I mentioned that we were going to type something in here, and that would then take you to the individual post, or at least when we click here, the URL will now say new because that's called new, and then that would take us to the individual post. So we're not going to do that just yet. What we're going to do is we're going to connect this up so when we click on the item, it takes us to that single page. So back in React here, we're going to open up the components. We're just going to create a new component. We're just going to call this file single.js. So that's going to show a single item. So now we've made our new component, let's just go back into Django. There's a few things that we need to do to get this working. Now, if you remember in the blog, we've made a model. The model included the slug. So what's happening here is that when we make a new item or when we make a new post, we're generating a slug. And that's a usable piece of text that can be utilized in the URL. In addition to that, we need to also bring it into our serializers, because if you remember, we didn't actually include it originally in a serializer, so we need to add the slug there so we also return that data to React. That was a very bad description there of a slug. So if we go into the posts here, I've just changed them. I've just added some more posts. You can see that we've got a title here, and what the slug does, it takes the title and makes it into a URL-friendly string. So this can be utilized in the URL. Now let's just head back into the views where we were, so the blog API views, and I've changed title to slug because what I want to do is I want to select the item based upon the slug that we pass over and not the title. That makes sense shortly once we start coding in React. So now we have our new component, which is the single. So what we're going to do now is go into the index, and you can see that I've created a new route here for the post. So we've got slug component single. So we can utilize that. So we can take out this slug, and we can then utilize that within our logic to then send off an Axios request for that particular slug. And obviously that slug here that we're talking about that's in the URL, that's going to be passed over to Django, and we're then going to run a query on the database and look for the slug that matches the particular post and then return that individual post. So now that's in place, we can then also just make sure that you import the single in at the top here. So now let's go into the single. So I've already created this, so I can just run through this for you. So you can see that we've got React again, we've imported Axios, and then we're going to be utilizing use params, and I'll show you that in a second from the router DOM. This is just the material UI items as per normal. Like in the previous tutorials, we've got the user styles here, just some overwrite styles for material UI, overriding styles, and we're not actually using those. I just put those in place there. So you can see here that use params. So what this is it allows us to extract from the URL in this case, the parameter slug. So if we go back into the index, we created this additional component here, and that's the item that we want to capture. So what we're doing here in the single is we're just capturing that item. We're calling it slug, so we're making a new variable called slug, and we're storing that inside of there. And then we go ahead and we've created our state. Now, I'm not too sure why I called it hits. I'm not too sure. So just change that. So we're going to store the posts. So here we go. We create an Axios request, get, and then we draw in, or we add in the slug. So what we're going to do is we're going to send across the slug item. So that's the component at the top in the URL. So now we've got that. That's what gets sent across. So if we go back into Django, you can see we collect that item and then we run it against the database. So we've collected it from the URL, from the data, the request, that we sent across, and we put it into item, and then we run the database query. So back in here, then we collect the data. We collect the data, and then we put it then in our state. So now we're storing it right here in our state, the data that gets returned. So down here, we've got our container, and then we've got some other elements here. Ultimately, it's just a small element set here, and you can see that I'm outputting the data. What is it called? Post or posts? So data posts. Data posts. And so you can see that I'm outputting just the title and the excerpt. And there we go. So all I've done is I've called, I've sent off a request with the slug, I've made a match, and then I return the individual item. So what I need now is some links, because on the home page, which is the posts, here I need to actually create some links to the individual items. So what's happening here in the post page, we're looping through all the different posts that's returned from the database. So this is just going to be a simple case of just extracting the slug item from the post. So you can see what I've done here is I've just created this link. So I needed to bring in link up here. So I've just created a link. I'm not using navlink. So I've just removed navlink. We could integrate it into navlink, but I've just kept it nice and simple for now. We've created a link here. We've wrapped it around the media, the card media, which is the image that gets shown. And you can see here I've just created a link to posts and then post slug. So that should send us to the post page, and then the slug will be collected and sent off and so on. So let's just go back to our React application. Here we got the home page, and we're going to click on the images here, which have been generated by an API. So we click on those, and there we go. So we've got the individual post and so on. Well, thank you very much. So we come to the end of this Viewsets and Routers. Hopefully I've given you enough information to understand the basics of Viewsets and Routers. And in addition to that, hopefully the example that I've provided did help to kind of expand the point and just showcase the basics of Viewsets and Routers.